Growing up, we generally have to do things that we don't want to do, eat those things that we don't want to eat, we don't like, but it's good for us. We have to do chores and tasks and things like that, and that we may not want to do, but our parents understand that these are about teaching us how to live life and to accept responsibility. And even in the spiritual life, in our spiritual life, in the spiritual realm, we have to do things and go through things that we probably would rather not do, that we'd rather not face. And this is true of everyone. Um, and one of the greatest uh, passages I think that really get into explaining this is found in Second Corinthians chapter 12. And the Apostle Paul, writing here, he says, "Boasting is necessary, it is not profitable. But I will move on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who was caught up into the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. I know that this man, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows, was caught up into paradise. He heard inexpressible words which a man is not allowed to speak. I will boast about this person, but I will not boast about myself, except of my weaknesses. For if I want to boast, I will not be a fool, because I will be telling the truth, but I will spare you so that no one can credit me with something beyond what he sees in me or hears from me, especially because of the extraordinary revelations. Therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me, so I would not exalt myself. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times to take it away from me. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, catastrophes, persecution, and pressures because of Christ. So Paul begins by recounting this event, and most commentators, the vast majority of commentators, agree that Paul is not actually talking about another person. He's actually talking about something that happened to himself. And that definitely seems to be the case when you look at how he draws the contrast. But he is talking about having this vision of heaven. He says, I saw these things and I heard these things, and it's not even permissible for me to say what I heard and to describe what I saw. It was so much greater than what I could imagine, what human minds could comprehend. And Paul, after having this vision, he struggled with this idea, with this desire, that he wanted to go out and say, "Look at me, uh, look at what happened." He wanted to boast about himself. Look at how spiritual I am. That God would see fit to provide for me, provide this vision to me, and not to other people. But God, on the other hand, wanted it clear that it was him and not Paul, that it wasn't about Paul. It wasn't about how good or great Paul was. It was about how good and great God is. So he brought this challenge into the life of Paul. Paul says that he would love to glory, and the word that he uses in verse 6 means to vaunt or boast or rejoice. And so his natural inclination was that he was so spiritual that he had this great experience, and he should be looked up to because of this. He wanted to be revered, he wanted to be respected, he wanted to be looked up to. He felt that he had earned that pat on the back and the glory that should come with it for having received so great a vision, because after all, look at how spiritual he is. But that's not what God wanted. And so what we're told and what Paul explains is that God gave him a thorn in the flesh. Now, there is some question as to what this is. Um, it seems to have clearly been a physical problem of some kind, um, but we really don't know. Um, some of the ideas that have been proposed have been malaria, eye trouble, migraines, epilepsy. We know that Paul did actually suffer from eye trouble. He references that in some of his letters. But whether that was this thorn in the flesh or something else, we don't really know. But those have been some serious suggestions that have been made. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the problem was. The what doesn't matter all that much. It's not really that important. I know it's one of those mysteries that we come in and we say, well, I'd like to know the answer to that. Yeah, but it's not important. It doesn't really matter. In the long run, in the end, it's not going to matter what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. But there's 2 points about this that Paul makes about this thorn in the flesh that are important. Number one is that it was God who brought it into his life. Paul recognizes that it was God who brought this into his life, that this was by the design, by the plan, by the will of God. But he also recognizes that it was satanic in origin. And 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 he says this, a messenger of Satan to torment me. And there's this reality that we sometimes miss when we talk about spiritual warfare and spiritual issues, that we miss it, and because we miss it, we miss out on what it really means. And so let me kind of explain it this way. God is sovereign. And what that means is that God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants, to whomever he wants, in whatever way he wants. But Satan, while at enmity as an enemy of God, even Satan cannot attack without God's permission and cannot act outside of God's purpose ultimately. You see this perfectly illustrated in the life of Job, that Satan had to have permission from God before he could attack Job, that 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 Satan couldn't just go in and do whatever he wanted, that he had certain barriers, certain limits that God put in place as far as what Satan could or could not do when it came to Job. In fact, we even see, if you go in and you read the book of Job and read those first couple chapters, what you find out is not just that sometimes it gets misinterpreted that Satan comes to God and starts complaining about how God is protecting Job. That's not the case. It's God who actually instigates everything with Job, concerning Job. When you get into the book of Job, it's God who starts it all. And so when you understand this and then you look at the life of Paul, yes, it was whatever the attack on Paul's life was, it was satanic in origin. It was Satan who was working. It was Satan who was trying to bring about these things, but it was part of God's overall plan to keep Paul humble. And so this truth is ultimately very clearly seen when Paul explains that I prayed 3 times. 3 times I went to God and I begged and I pleaded that he take this away from me. Because I'm sure that in Paul's mind, as he looked at it, he said, this is too much, this is too big, I can't deal with this, it's too heavy, it's too much to bear for me. And God's response 3 times was that his grace and his strength were sufficient. And the words that the Lord uses here, that Paul relays, grace and power, these are interesting words. Because the word grace here, it is best understood as pleasure. And the word power or strength, it speaks of miraculous power, of God's miraculous power. And so what God is really answering, and I want you to get this because this is so important. The response by God is actually this, that my being pleased with what's happening in your life is more important than what you're going through. Because when you're weak, then I reveal myself and my miraculous power is seen. God is saying to Paul, no, I'm not going to take it away from you. I'm not going to lift this from you. I'm not going to remove it from you, because in your weakness, in your inability to deal, in your incapacity, when you lack the capacity and the strength and the effectiveness, then that's when I'm seen. And this strikes at the heart of what we so oftentimes get wrong about our walk with Christ. We think that our walk with Christ is learning to deal with stuff. We think about that our walk with Christ is about learning how to overcome and what we can do. And we oftentimes hear people say this, that, oh, well, you just give God your best. Your best is not sufficient. Your best is not good enough. What is needed is God's best. And this brings us to the first principle that I want you to see in this, that even my greatest strengths and my greatest weaknesses are insignificant to God's miraculous power and pleasure. It doesn't matter how strong I am. It doesn't matter what abilities I have, what skills I have, what gifts that God has given me. Those don't really matter. And on the other hand, my weaknesses, my inabilities also don't matter. Because it's not about us. What matters, and they're insignificant to God's miraculous power and pleasure. The question is not what can I do or what am I incapable of doing, but what can God do? This is where this issue of grace and God's power come into play in our lives. And so again, we oftentimes see these issues in our life, these problems in our life, as being things that we have to learn to overcome. And yes, there are certain things that we have to overcome. There are certain challenges in life that we have to overcome. Sometimes there are sin problems in our life that we have to overcome. There are other faults and failures that we have to overcome. Some things in life are about us learning how to overcome that. But just because you have a weakness in your life, just because there's an obstacle or limitation. See, the weaknesses in my life are not necessarily obstacles or limitations that I need to overcome, but rather an opportunity for God to reveal his power, strength, and grace in us and through us. Paul makes this very clear. He wanted people to see, and he talks about this in both 1st and 2nd Corinthians, how he wanted the people at Corinth to see him for who he really was, to see him with all of the all of the warts, all of the flaws, all of the failures, because he knew that once they understood and once they saw him in his weaknesses and they saw that, you know what, this Paul that everyone reveres, that everyone thinks so highly of, that everyone thinks so much of, he's actually just a person. He's a person just like anyone else. And rather, as people saw that in Paul, that allowed them to ask, how in the world can just this regular old person accomplish so much? And it's there that they started to see the Lord. That's why God says, no, I won't take the thorn in the flesh from you. I want people to see your weaknesses. I want people to see, to know of your inabilities, Paul, because it is in your inabilities that my power, my grace, my miracles are really truly seen. That's what God is saying here. That's why God leaves the thorn in the flesh, is so that what Paul what Paul does is he learns not only to rely on the power of God, but he allows the power of God to shine through him. And if you're trying to make your problems go away, if you think that oh well, this is something that has to go away, this weakness, this temptation, this physical inability, this stutter, this whatever, this fear, I have to make it go away, you're wrong. Because it's not about you overcoming that. It's about God's power and grace being revealed in your life. So how do we get there? How is it that we learn to accept? Well, here's how this works. I have to be humbled and accept what God is doing, with or without understanding, and boast what God accomplishes. See, this is what Paul had to learn to do in his life with what he was struggling with the thorn in the flesh. Is he first of all he had to be humbled. He had to come in and say, okay, I'm not as big a deal as I'd like to think. I'm not some super spiritual great giant because I have this vision of heaven. I have to make the decision to be humble. Secondly, I have to accept what God is doing and accept that I can't change it. You know, we we oftentimes live with this fantasy idea that we control things in our lives, and there's very very little that we can control. The only thing that we absolutely have control over in our lives is our ability to respond to what happens. Most everything else, most of the control that we think we have, it is nothing more than a myth. It is nothing more than a fantasy. And what we have to do is we have to learn that God is the one who's in control. And even when he is acting in a way, whether we understand whether he explains himself or not, we say, okay, God, I may not understand what you're doing. I may not understand why you're doing it, but I'm going to accept it. I'm going to accept that you are bringing this into my life at this time. That what is happening is by your choice. And then as we see God do great things in us and through us, and we know that it's not me who did it, then we boast what God does. We boast what God accomplishes. Because in the end, that's where God's grace is seen. When we learn that it's not about me, it's not about what I can do, and it's not about my successes or my failures. It's about who He is and what He can do and what He is doing. And we learn to trust in Him. And we learn to rely on His strength and His provision. And as we become more concerned about Him being pleased with our lives, with Him being pleased with where we are, with where we're going, with what we're doing, with what we are encountering, and we become less concerned about what I want, what my desire is. The desire is to see His power flowing through us. Not every thorn in the flesh, not every struggle, not every pain, not every difficulty is a struggle, pain, and difficulty. Sometimes they're really a blessing that we don't fully see and understand and comprehend. Thank you for joining in on this Bible study. If you have not done so, please like and share this video so that we can share God's Word. We would also like to ask you to subscribe to our channel here and check us out on Facebook. And if you're in the Fort Worth area, know that you're always welcome to join us for any of our services and Bible study.